Hello, and welcome to my session. My name is Ross Crockett. I'm an engineer in the Genentech South San Francisco campus. And this afternoon, I'm delighted to share with you in this session the approaches for the design and selection of single-use assemblies in the clinical drug substance manufacturing facility. So to kick things off, just to give you a brief intro into myself, I am a graduate of UC Berkeley's chemical engineering program, having spent the early part of my career in the Advanced Biofuels Process Demonstration Unit at the Lawrence Berkeley Lab. I then quickly transitioned to Genentech in South San Francisco, where I spent the first 5 to 6 years of my career, pretty much exclusively working on drug substance make, assess, release from phase 1 to commercial launch in our South San Francisco DS manufacturing facility. And then in March of last year, right around the onset of the COVID pandemic, I actually transitioned to a new role in the Roche Genentech Clinical Supply Center, where I'm responsible for the operational readiness of the facility. And so when I talk about the facility, I'm actually talking about the Clinical Supply Center, which is a brand new brown/greenfield manufacturing facility we are building in South San Francisco. Mechanical completion is expected in Q3, Q4 of this year, with full GMP operation in 2022. So the scope of this facility is a drug substance manufacturing facility up to 2,000 liter production with a fully single-use closed process manufacturing line for parallel multi-product operations with capacity for future expansion as well as cell bank generation and manufacturing capabilities of up to 1.5 runs per week. The strategy behind this building is that it's designed for easy reconfiguration and future technology implementation, making use of things like single-use technology and digital manufacturing, with maintaining a co-location for our R&D colleagues in South San Francisco for speed and ease of tech transfer. So as I mentioned previously, it will be an agile, small volume facility that leverages new technologies and empowered people to bring innovative new medicines to patients at unprecedented speed. Having previously mentioned some of the elements of single-use technology and digital manufacturing, one other highlight is that we are looking to accommodate a wide range of known and unknown future process platforms and therapeutic modalities. So some of the design highlights and what we're running into as challenges, which is the focus of this discussion for this session, is some of the elements of the design of the facility. There are no CIP and parts wash. Every single element of our process will either be single use or product dedicated. The entire manufacturing area for DS is in an ISO 9 ballroom without any separation between unit operations. Everything is closed or functionally closed via chemical sanitization, so there is no steam in place system or autoclave. All of the equipment that we're bringing in, as well as the automation, will be a streamlined commissioning and qualification approach, leveraging ASTM E2500, as well as a paperless, entirely digital manufacturing area. And last but not least, the equipment portability aspect, as well as a changeover, leveraging single-use technology, allows for the easy reconfiguration and movement of equipment within the ballroom and no product-to-product changeover downtimes. So, knowing that we are walking into a facility that is entirely single use, without access to CIP, without access to SIP, autoclaves, or other sterilizing measures, we realized pretty early on in this facility that we would need a wide range of materials to support our single-use processing. And so we developed a request for proposal approach for all of the single-use assemblies that we intend to use in the facility, with the goal of generating a catalog of single-use assemblies to supply the end-to-end drug substance manufacturing process. Roche Genentech invited qualified suppliers to then bid on any and all of the supporting assemblies and materials for the facility, at which point we would assess and select business partners. So within the scope of this request for proposal approach were items like solution filtration and storage, product filtration, transfer assemblies, sample manifolds, and miscellaneous other single-use assemblies. Outside of the scope of this were some of the hardware-associated consumables that were driven by a separate process and project within the Genentech business organization. So our approach for this request for proposal were in 3 parts. The first being the development of a single-use facility material philosophy document. The second, the generation of what we called visual user requirement specifications. And the third, a multi-business unit collaborative selection framework to determine which vendors we would be partnering with. So the first part, at the start of the process, we authored a single-use philosophy document, which listed out our qualified materials and connectors within the Roche Genentech internal network. And in order to be considered for this selection for our facility, all submitted assemblies were required to use the Roche qualified materials with an emphasis to the suppliers on off-the-shelf designs if possible as the preference. We also highlighted that we were standardizing our aseptic connectors that were selected based on our previous Roche performance requirements, material of construction, compatibility, and internal robustness data. And similarly, we provided the process streams and contact times that we were expecting to use within the facility to the vendors, with the idea that we would then collectively have modular assemblies that are using pre-assessed Roche qualified materials to supply all of our single-use needs. The second approach and the second element we added to the request for proposal process was authorship of a visual URS. And so this provided all of our supplier partners an idea as to how we intend to use the assemblies and connect them for our manufacturing process. And so what I've highlighted in this slide is a simple rendering of one of the bioreactor systems that we used with the individual items that we expected to receive as part of the request for proposal. So for each individual item listed as a RFP lot number, we provided simple requirements around what the assembly should look like, with the idea that the expected result would be assemblies with the vendor recommended configurations based on the process requirements that we provided. And certainly last but not least was the selection framework. So after having gone through this process and selected the vendors with which we wanted to partner with and receiving all of the relevant information as part of the request for proposal, we now had a catalog of assemblies from which to select and created a business decision framework amongst three of our business partners, quality, procurement, and technical, to assess all of these pieces of information. So from procurement, clearly compliant supply of materials, total cost of ownership, and service level were considerations. For quality, in particular, we focused on change management, supplier performance, and defect trending. And for technical requirements, certainly we reviewed the materials of construction, the modular design requirements, meeting our user requirements, and certainly with an eye towards sustainability as a differentiating factor. So what this chevron is supposed to denote is what we called our table stakes, which were from the 7 suppliers that we invited to be a part of this request for proposal process, how we moved from a list of 7 and narrowed down to a list of 3 preferred suppliers that we would use for the facility. So the first table stakes, if you will, were, do the suppliers meet the quality and regulatory requirements that we have at Roche Genentech? I mean, it was a bit of a unnecessary step, as the 7 particular suppliers that we bid the business out to were all within Roche Genentech already, and so we knew walking in they would meet that requirement. The next set of narrowing criteria was, did they meet the user requirement specifications set forth in the philosophy document and the visual user requirement document? And so we were able to eliminate a supplier from that based on the requirements set forth in the request. The next step was looking at if they were a demonstrated global supplier within our Roche manufacturing drug substance and drug product network, which we were able to eliminate a further 2 suppliers based on that performance. And last but not least, our narrowing and final criteria were elements around our strategic business continuity plan, operational delivery, and what's the reported quoted lead times were for the vendors. And so with that said, we were able to narrow down our selection to a core list of 3 suppliers that we were comfortable and ready to move forward with based on some of the finer details of the request for proposal process. So with these 3 selected suppliers, we were able to specifically do a more quantitative analysis on some of the elements of their bids, and specifically actually do some direct head-to-head comparisons. And so what I'll highlight in the next 2 slides are 2 elements of the direct evaluation that we were able to do. The first being, we were able to quantify the assembly price and lead time variance by suppliers pretty robustly, and really asked ourselves the question, just how different are like assemblies from various competitors? So for individual lots, individual assemblies of all of the different assemblies we were using and expecting to introduce, we were able to do a head-to-head comparison because at this point, based on our selection criteria, all designs were required and confirmed to have met the philosophy document and our user requirements. So as a result, we could, on an item by item basis, actually evaluate the true cost difference with going with one supplier versus the other. And for some of the high usage or high criticality elements, we could also layer in the quoted delivery lead time as another metric for which we could evaluate against. And so having this true comparison and cost analysis was enabled us to elucidate a really insightful comparison across these different assembly types. The second element that we also looked into was what is the quantification of the true price of partnership? I'm sure many of you in the pharma industry are familiar with preferred suppliers or strategic partners for technology development. What we were able to do with this process was actually quantify how much that cost would weigh into our manufacturing operations and a holistic unit operation basis. And so another exercise we did is if we selected those suppliers that were our strategic partners, what would be the opportunity cost in a manufacturing facility for that moving forward? So in certain instances, take case in point operation number 1, suppliers 2 and 4 were essentially equivalent, but one was already our strategic partner. And so we were able to quantify that there really was not an opportunity cost lost by going with our strategic partner. However, with operation 7, as you can see, there's almost a near doubling of the cost of goods as a result of the continued strategic partnership should we select supplier number 5 for that operation moving into the facility. And so this drove some very robust, heated, animated, if you will, discussions amongst not only our technical and procurement partners, but our development colleagues as well, to really pressure test truly what was and what is the purpose of those partnerships and how we can continue to drive value in a facility by exploring alternates. So with that, I'll sum this up briefly. The Genentech Clinical Supply Center is an agile small volume facility that we expect to be operational in the early part of 2022 for GMP manufacturing. And that by taking a holistic facility-wide harmonized design philosophy, we were able to assess opportunities for where assemblies could be consolidated and even aligned to match requirements. Selection of these SKUs and suppliers need to balance procurement requirements, quality expectations, supply chain considerations, and certainly cost of goods implications. And the last two are really what I'd like to focus on. These direct head-to-head bids afforded us unprecedented insight into the assembly price landscape across similar designs in the industry and from what we're receiving from our suppliers. And lastly, the relative cost of strategic partner or technology partners can be directly quantified using this method and evaluated against competitors, which ultimately will, in our instance, drive value added towards the total cost of ownership considerations. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your time and your attendance. And at this point, I'm happy to take any questions that the audience may have.
Thank you, Ross. We've received a few questions already, so please make sure to enter any questions you may have in the Ask a Question box. Our first question is, how has the COVID-19 pandemic influenced evaluation or decision-making of supplier selections?
Yeah, that's probably the number one question on this whole talk. So for full transparency, we started this process and this request for proposal back in the April-May timeframe of 2020. So towards the beginnings of the true COVID-19 impact on the global supply chain. And having moved through this process, I think one of the more significant impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic is the continual shift in lead time expectations. And certainly for a clinical facility that does not yet exist, it's definitely been a challenge for us to continue to negotiate for the materials that we have selected and partnered with particular suppliers on in the landscape of what the industry is going through right now. So one element that we've been trying to be as communicative as possible is very transparent lines of communications with our partners in these suppliers to understand what the real impacts are with as much confidence as possible. We can expect to receive these materials and how we can continue to move forward and prioritize based on the needs of our project and certainly our supplier partners.
Perfect, thank you. Our next question is, can you describe your strategy for leachables and extractables assessment and management?
Yeah, absolutely. So within this particular facility, having previously mentioned that we are using Roche internally qualified materials for all of these assemblies, these are all materials that we have robust data packages on for extractable, leachable considerations and evaluations. And so for particular operations within our facility that we are particularly sensitive to or know could provide issues down the road, we in those particular instances specified particular grades of tubing and materials that we would expect to support that part of the extractable leachables evaluation. So in sum, we provided our list of qualified Roche materials that we do have extractable leachable packages on that we could perform an assessment on a product by product basis. But where specifically we thought there might be impact, we did request particular materials of constructions and tubing brands, if you will.
Thank you. So another question, how were existing assembly designs in use at Roche compared and evaluated within the scope of the project?
Yeah, that's another fascinating question, and one that I don't think I spoke to really enough. So understanding that within our drug substance manufacturing network, we do have a number of sites that are using either a hybrid single-use technology or just starting on that process. Prior to launching the bid for the request for proposal, we did a robust analysis of the existing SKUs across a wide range of supplier partners that are currently used in the drug substance network to understand if any of them would be leverageable. I would say of the total assemblies that we originally scoped in, we were probably able to reduce the SKU count by about 5 to 10% as a result of using existing systems. The challenge became through this process and authoring the Clinical Supply Center philosophy document, we actually started to standardize to particular aseptic connectors that not every design within our manufacturing network had. And so that became a really interesting question as far as should we leverage existing designs that don't exactly meet that user requirement or philosophy document, but are in wide use in the network. And so ultimately we took a mix of both and determined those particular SKUs that we thought would be valuable to continue using based on our experience versus having that as part of the bid to be more inclusive of our preferred materials and connectors.
Perfect. Well, thank you. That's all the time we have for questions today. Thank you again, Ross, for a great presentation.
Great. Thank you all.
Hello, everybody. My name is Chris Garvin. I'm part of a group called Digital Integration and Predictive Technologies at Amgen within the Process Development Organization. And in that group in particular, my area is focused on getting more out of our real-time data in our manufacturing environments. We have a team that was recently formed to do this. And today I'll talk to you a little bit about some of the work we're doing in this space and how it connects to the bigger picture of digital strategy and in particular digital plant strategy and manufacturing at Amgen. So in the talk today, we'll take this in 4 parts. First, a little bit about the motivation. Why was this group formed? What is it that we're trying to do? And what is the bigger picture around that? And then given that we were formed recently, we'll go through a little bit of what the digital landscape at Amgen looks like today. So what is the foundation that we're really trying to build upon? And then with that in mind, where are we trying to go? What's our ambition and vision for the future? And talk a little bit about how our group is contributing to that. And then in particular, we'll focus on a couple of projects that are in the early stages of helping us along that pathway to what our future vision is. Okay, so let's start with the motivation. Now, it's actually been a very interesting time at Amgen and more broadly in this industry where, digital technologies, which is an area I've been in for my entire career, we've always been a little bit on the periphery of things, to be honest. And all of a sudden, we find ourselves in the middle of these conversations around organizational strategy and direction. And there's a lot of excitement and energy around that, and it's great, of course, for us, but I think it's really exciting for the industry as well. On the left side of the screen, you see some of the things that our leaders are saying right now about the importance of digital technologies within the operations organization. And, if we kind of step back and think about what is the reason that this is now in the midst of these, the core of these conversations. Well, number one is the need is maybe greater than ever to do things differently. We have lots of drivers around reducing costs, ensuring right first-time processes, consistent quality. Some of those things, we've had those drivers forever, but maybe the pressure around them is greater than it's been historically. And there's a recognition that we need to do things maybe a little bit differently to continue to to advance in those areas. On the other side of this, we have the opportunity now, because we have access to new techniques and technologies we've never had before. We have more data than we've ever had access to, and we have computing power that used to be only available in specialized places. Now it's, literally in my phone, I can do things that I used to not be able to do on a giant computer. So, we have the opportunity, we have the need, and the marrying of those two things now has put us in a position to really take advantage of these technologies to advance the way that we operate. And again, that recognition by our leadership is recognized and obvious in some of the statements that you see coming from them. So, given that motivation, what is it that we're dealing with today? What does our landscape look like? Well, first, and this slide actually coincidentally was also shown in Thomas Seewister's presentation earlier. When we talk about innovation at Amgen, there are a bunch of different pillars around that, and the fact that data and digital technologies is showing up here is again just recognition of its importance to how our leadership is thinking about the way that these technologies could change the way we operate. But what have we done? So we're not starting from scratch today. Actually, over the last 5-6 years, there's been a lot of evolution in the way that we organize and use data at Amgen. For example, we have a pretty amazing enterprise data lake and data fabric and analytics layer on top of that allows us to access data in ways that used to be almost impossible to do, and then to create visualizations, striking visualizations and dashboards that people can use to really better understand the processes that we're running and how they relate to a bunch of other things that we need to pay attention to. That's very important to us to have that type of data accessibility. We've solved one really big, long-standing problem. The other is that we are using tools now pervasively that used to be maybe only relevant to niche areas at Amgen. So for instance, real-time multivariate process monitoring is something that's available in every one of our plants today. It's really recognized as essential way of running our operations. And that's also a wonderful starting point for us. But we're not perfect either. There are plenty of gaps in the way that we use data. Number one, even though maybe we're not generating huge amounts of data, even with the amounts that we generate, we barely use any of it to actually run our operations or make decisions. And so my group is really focused on how do we tap into more of that information we're already generating to better understand what we're doing, make better decisions, and run our plants more optimally. The other part of it is, there was a nice talk earlier today on culture and the cultural changes needed to instill some of these types of technologies in our organizational philosophy. That is certainly a challenge for us. We spend a lot of time thinking about how do we engage best with our end users, making sure that they have what they need, but also how do we build things into our processes so that it's not a decision to use something, but it's actually part of the fabric of how we operate. And therefore it doesn't seem like an extra burden to maybe use some of these technologies. So that's where we are today. Now let's talk about where we want to go. So first of all, this also happened to be shown by Thomas earlier today, a little bit of a different twist on it. This slide was presented by Maria Perry from Amgen a couple of years ago at a conference. And at that time when we were talking about the future, we were talking about how do we enable these predictive technologies and analytics in our, in the way that we operate in process development and manufacturing. That is now pretty much what we do today. Maybe it's not everywhere yet, but there are pockets of it. And at the very least, it's a near-term expectation that that's how we'll be operating. So the future now is a little bit more aggressive, I would say, or ambitious perhaps. We are thinking about not just predicting, but how do we create this adaptive operation where you have an ability to respond in real time to changing conditions in your raw materials, in your equipment performance, in your supply and demand, in your labor resource availability. All the things that you have information on today that are perhaps either manually used to change things and how you're operating, or maybe not used at all. We want to build that in so that we have plants that can adapt in real time. And maybe this isn't something that's available next year, but that is at the end of the tunnel. That's where we want to be. And our group is very much engaged in this strategy discussion, but also thinking about what are the things we're going to lay down today as the groundwork that we'll build upon for these future aspirations. And for us, that means starting from the real-time process monitoring, which I mentioned is really everywhere already, to looking at how do we embed more of these predictions and forecasts in our operational decision making, to then moving beyond even prescription to adaptive control of our processes, very narrowly focused on how do we control our processes more optimally. But once you establish that for a unit operation and then start thinking across unit operations, how do you control more optimally, you can build on that to enable some of the things we talked about around this adaptive plant way of thinking. And maybe most importantly is these digital technologies are not just going to be used to do to operate a plant in the same way we do today, but maybe faster or more efficiently. We want to really use them to rethink how we even design a plant or design a process, and take advantage of the fact that we have the ability to do things differently with these digital technologies to reimagine what it means to be a manufacturing plant. And so we feel a lot of the things we're doing today are steps in that direction and very much aligned with this future vision of where we want to go. So let me I guess with that background, I'll double click for a moment on what it is our group actually does in this space. If you think kind of generically about a manufacturing operation generating data, we have ways of measuring that data today. We do look at advanced sensors, so things that will allow us to maybe measure something differently or give us better information on which to build models and make decisions. But the core of what we do is really these data-driven models that are used along that spectrum from monitoring to prediction to prescription and control. And we think about these things as having kind of two pathways they can take. One is feeding that information to a person who has an opportunity to make a decision on how to act based on the information they received. And that could be sort of an ad hoc decision with information in hand, or it could be prescribed by a batch record that tells a person to look at a result from a model in order to change something in the process. Or you could close the loop and embed these into your control system so that you have, as we were talked about before, an ability to really adapt in real time and continuously look at how are my inputs looking and what does that mean for how I'm trying to achieve certain levels of output. We think of this as sort of a stepwise process. It's more comfortable now to put these decisions in the hands of a person, but ultimately we want to be able to automate as much of this as possible to get to that end goal. So what I'll do now is talk a little bit about 3 projects along that spectrum, from monitoring to prediction to control. And if we start on the monitoring end, I mentioned we have a use of these multivariate monitoring tools in our plants today, but primarily that's used for process monitoring. So when you actually have product and a piece of equipment, you're monitoring how that process is evolving. But what about the equipment itself? This is something that's been a struggle for a long time at Amgen, at least, where historically we have used calendar-based maintenance. And if you think about the analogy with your car, that means let's say you schedule an annual appointment to get your car checked, maybe every June, and maybe that works sometimes, but sometimes something can go wrong in the meantime, and you miss it because you weren't going as soon as you needed to. From calendar-based, you can move to meter-based, where it's sort of the odometer analogy. Now you're looking at how much mileage do I have on my car or a piece of equipment. And based on that usage, things that get used more may need to be maintained more often. And at least that gets you a little bit closer to doing it when you need to. But it's still not taking advantage of this richness of data that we have available. And so what we're looking at here is what we call condition-based maintenance, where you're just monitoring the data and looking for signals that are telling you something has changed. And based on that information in the signal, can you make a decision or better decision about when to maintain your equipment? And we were fortunate to already have a great platform in place that we built upon. And now we have what we call a check engine light, again, to the car analogy, to let us know when a piece of equipment looks like it needs at least a checkup to see if there's something required. And we've had a great amount of success around this project. It was piloted at our Rhode Island site, dozens of success stories, at the very least telling us, or maybe saving us an unexpected maintenance activity so we could anticipate something and schedule it at a time when it made sense, to cases where we actually may have saved a catastrophic equipment failure that could have resulted in batch loss eventually. So the success was so great that now it's being expanded across our manufacturing network as a standard for how we monitor our equipment. So from the monitoring stage, now we can talk about prediction. And one of the challenges we have with prediction models is, number one, they're time consuming to build and update. And number two, it requires people with specialized skills to do this. And so we asked ourselves, can we apply machine learning, which will allow a model to learn on its own and adapt and change over time without manual intervention, to do some of this work for us? And we created something we call real-time machine learning, applied it to our plant in Puerto Rico in one specific case, looking to predict titer for one of our processes there. The model itself selects from a number of algorithms based on the data and data structure available. It makes a prediction. It then puts it into a visualization that lets people dissect the information around that prediction to better understand what the drivers are and make a decision off it. And this too has been quite successful. Not only has it allowed us to reduce the amount of manual labor from modeling, but actually the predictions themselves were better than what we got off our more traditional methods. So this was a very exciting thing to see. This is now also being expanded into multiple places. And maybe the most important point here is that, and this also applies to the previous example, we don't want to just make one good model one time. We want to do this in a way that it's standardized and scalable so that you have essentially a module that you can take out of one instance and plug into another and just reconnect those pipelines with very minimal change or adaptation over time, so that you can scale this thing out super quickly once you have that proven in one place. That's very important to us. We support all of Amgen's sites around the world, so the quicker we can move from pilot phase to a full-scale implementation, the better for everybody. And the final case I'll mention here is now on the control side of things. As you know, in our industry, we tend to control things in very narrow ranges within our design space. And that's, for a reason, right? We want to make sure we have very consistent control setup. We're very comfortable doing that. We have a lot of great history that's been proven doing it that way. But while this allows us to run our processes very consistently, what it doesn't do is allow us to respond to changes in our inputs such that we're always optimizing the outputs out of our process. And the opportunity here then is to apply a different type of control. And we're looking at model predictive control here to ensure that any disturbances to our process, whether they be from raw materials or equipment or otherwise, are accounted for as we're controlling the process, and we're constantly looking at what that means for our outputs. We have good success in the labs already doing this. Historically, we're now doing some simulation work to refine the approaches we're taking here and going back to the labs later this year to prove it out. But maybe the most important thing to mention here is that we really see this work, while it's maybe very narrowly focused on a bioreactor today, as the cornerstone for a lot of that future vision that we talked about before. If this can be proven in one case and then shown to be scaled from there, this forms that groundwork for where we want to be with an adaptive plant concept. So in closing then, just review a couple of things we talked about. So the motivation again is that we have this, this interesting time of a convergence of opportunity and business need, as well as the maturity of the technology that's relevant to meet some of those needs. The ambition from Amgen is clearer than it's ever been to create this digital plant vision where you have an adaptive set of processes and infrastructure around it that allows your plant to continue to optimize. And in our group, we've started applying these concepts in some very simple cases to prove them out and start building the foundation for what we want to see in that ambition down the road. So with that, I will wrap up and be happy to take any questions from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. We've received a few questions already, but please make sure to enter any questions you may have in the Ask a Question box. So our first question is, how does Amgen think about validating machine learning models?
Okay, thanks. So yeah, this is a big topic at Amgen, and otherwise, I think across the industry, we're hearing this come up quite a bit. Machine learning models are challenging because the intent there is to allow them to change on their own over time. But there's, of course, a question about how much you should let them change. And maybe the safest approach that we've found, at least initially, is you have sort of a version of that model that's on the side and learning, but you also have a deployed, validated version of that model that remains static. And while the one on the side is learning, you're still saving the manual effort of updating that model. But you then take, maybe after a certain number of batches, you take that model and you deploy the new static version of that into your production environment. That's the safe, maybe foot in the door approach, but we are not satisfied with that, to be honest. So I think we're looking at how do you, put some bounds around what a model is able to do when it's been deployed and allow it to adapt to some extent so that you're taking the full advantage of what machine learning can provide.
Perfect, thank you. Our next question, adaptive control allow you to feed glucose as needed if the glucose level goes down in your reactor. Does it let you change the collection? Sorry, it was a two-part, so I'll have you answer that one and then we'll do the second part.
Yeah, sure. Yes, that absolutely is one of the primary examples of where we would want to apply adaptive control. So yeah, for sure.
Okay, and the second part was, does it let you change the collection of loot volume if you see lower aggregate in your load?
Yeah, that's a good one. We haven't looked at that in detail yet, but certainly that's one of the examples that we're looking at from a downstream perspective. How do we make better decisions about where we cut off our elution? There's a lot that can go into that. I think we saw a nice talk previously on hybrid modeling and where that might play a role in some of those decisions. But I would say we're, I think, less mature in that space right now than we are in the bioreactor control.
Perfect, thank you. It looks like we have time for one more question. How widely deployed are the examples you showed?
Yeah, it depends on each case. So when we look at the monitoring models for equipment, that right now we have, I think, something like 400 models across our network right now covering different pieces of equipment and different operations. That is, a huge number of models for a very short time that we've been doing that. So that one is pretty widely deployed. The other two are more in early stages where we're, applying them to very specific cases initially to prove them out, to get some excitement about them, as well as some understanding for ourselves about how they might work more broadly. But I think at least for the real-time machine learning, we'll see that expand this year to a number of new cases, while the advanced control, I'd say, is maybe a couple of years away from being more widely deployed.
Well, thank you. That's all the time we have for questions today. Thank you again, Chris, for a great presentation.
Thanks so much. Thanks, everyone.